Let's all say good morning. Good morning. Yes, it is a good morning. It is a good day. Every day is a good day. When I'm really totally unprepared for this. That I was asked last night, and I told them that I would. And they had asked me about doing a prayer, and I said, well, okay, hold on. But anyway, then I just found out they said an introduction to the land acknowledgement. And the one thing is that we are here today because of our concerns for the social justice. And the one thing that we always need to be mindful about is how we interpret and our perceptions in those verbal acknowledgments. And yes, we are all here. Why are we here? Because this is an expression of who you are as a human being and as a person. To do what is right, to do what is necessary so the betterment of all people and that generations to come. The Lakotas, we have what we refer to as the 7 generations. We look at past 3 generations, apply it to our life today so that 3 generations in the future benefit, therefore making 7. Because we always need to be mindful not only of ourselves, but of our children and our children's children as well. And so, we have to look at that. And, one of the things they said was an introduction about land. We say, inimaka unchi, the earth, all of us, we are all connected to the earth. And that acknowledgement, but in today's times, we have this label that equates to ownership, our place of belonging. We are here, so yes, we belong here. And we are here for a purpose. And purpose is something that so many of us have lost. So with that, I want to go and say good morning. I hope today, all of you have an awakening to a greater tomorrow for the sake of our children. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Bud Baselat, the Provost here at Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Think Tank 2017, Educating for Struggle, State Violence Then and Now. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Professor Tim Black, who is serving as the interim director of the SJI, and is leading a dedicated group of faculty, staff, students, and many of the community members in advancing social justice issues on our campus here. Also, I want to thank Dr. Rhonda Williams. Rhonda, where are you at? Hiding in the back. Okay, who has returned to campus for this event, and Tim is doing an outstanding job providing leadership, but we clearly miss you on our campus, Rhonda. I just want to acknowledge that. I'd also like to thank and welcome our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Ibram Kendi, a renowned activist and scholar. The Social Justice Institute emerged, as many of you know, during the 2008 campus-wide process that created our strategic plan, Forward Thinking. That was actually a year before I arrived. This is now my 10th year, so the Institute has been around now for over a decade, in some form or another. And although social justice has long been, a key to our campus and very important and deeply held value on our campus, I think the Institute, as you know, over the last nearly decade, has really done much to forward that and to stimulate thought and to advance that effort here across our campus. The Social Justice Institute has this mission of working toward equal access to opportunity for all people through understanding and addressing the root causes of social injustice and developing innovative solutions. The biennial think tank event works to fulfill this mission by providing an opportunity for conversations to occur that can inform, inspire, heal, and produce solutions. And as I heard you were here till 10:30 last night, I presume much of that occurred at the session yesterday. The Institute, as well as the university, has, as you know, faced challenges in achieving the goals of creating a greater inclusion on our campus and improving community relations. However, much has been achieved, and much of that, again, particularly over the past 10 years, through the work and dedicated efforts of the leadership of the Social Justice Institute. Signature events such as this one, as well as the annual Power Up Student and Youth Leadership Forums, Race, Food, Justice Conference are all important and very well attended. The Institute has rapidly responded to community and national issues by hosting campus-wide read-ins and teach-ins focused on issues such as police brutality and racial profiling. And some of you have been definitely involved in some of those many activities. Students across our campus can now, through the hard work of many faculty and the Social Justice Institute, earn a social justice minor, which prepares students to address local, national, and global inequities throughout their lives and their career. To help achieve its mission, the Institute also supports innovative research and scholarship for faculty and students by funding research that combats inequality, and it also addresses many other local, national, and global issues related to social justice. Issues of social justice such as race, gender, immigration status, and gun violence remain at the forefront of issues that we need to address as a university and as a nation. The work of the Social Justice Institute in supporting innovative research, scholarship, and pedagogy, and in shaping relationships within the university and across our community is helping us to make progress on all of these fronts. Let me just add my welcome again to everybody here, and I really hope you have a great time at today's event and find it informative and inspiring. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So glad to see you all. I'm Dr. Marilyn Mobley, Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and it is really my pleasure to be here. I was here late last night, but Roxanne was so fearless. I left an event to come back to hear her, and I'm glad I stayed for the entire thing. It really set the tone, and thank you for your remarks at the beginning, Guy. That is connected to the tone she set last night. I'm so glad to be here because I was hired after the provost, and when I got here, I learned from Dr. Rhonda, who chaired the search for my job, that there was already a move afoot for something called social justice, and that it would be a Social Justice Institute. So I was one of the founding members. Am I allowed to say that, Dr. Rhonda? I'm one of the founding members, and so I'm glad that this effort was here. When you are hired to be the Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, you know such a move could only happen because there are social justice warriors on campus already. Many of them, I'm looking around the room, you're here, students, faculty, and staff. So there were social justice warriors who assisted Dr. Rhonda, and we had the support of President Snyder, we had the support of Provost Bazelak, but support of many people who are in this room who come to one social justice event after another. So we're so glad that you're here. For me, some of you know I'm a Toni Morrison Scholar, and I see the work of social justice on our campus very similar to how Baby Suggs worked in the clearing in the novel Beloved. If you know Beloved, it places us in an enslaved community. And as a Black woman, I used to always wonder, how did women in particular, when our bodies were the site of production and reproduction, how did we survive something like enslavement? I always wondered how people of color, period, women, children, and men endured. And I think it was because of people like Baby Suggs, who took people into the clearing. If you know that novel, she took people into the clearing, and in the clearing, she says, here, you've got to love yourself. You've got to love your neck, you've got to love your mouth, you've got to love your hands, because out there where the enslavement is taking place, they don't love you. They don't love your hands or your mouth or what comes out of it. So the way the clearing was a space for our souls and a space for our sanity, social justice has been that for me, a space for sanity and for my soul when the work gets hard. The work of diversity and inclusion matters. We do it on this campus every day. I know President Snyder mentioned some of it. We have a new way of enlarging the narrative. Toni Morrison says narrative is radical, changing us as it is being created. So on our campus, with the support of faculty, students, and staff, we've been trying to change the narrative. Social justice changed the narrative. We have a new initiative, the Trailblazer Project. If you go over to the library, we're trying to tell the wider story of who has contributed on a distinguished stage from our campus. They may have gotten their degrees here, but they went on to excel in Cleveland and around the nation and around the world. And if you walked around our campus, you didn't really see that. So that was an attempt to broaden the narrative. The way that our university was connected to the Underground Railroad, that was a way of expanding the narrative. But because we're an educational institution, the work of the Social Justice Institute is also engaged in that work of expanding the narrative and telling parts of the story that have not been told. So this year's theme is really important. We've always had the first part, educating for struggle. That's been part of every title. I think if I'm not mistaken, every title is educating for struggle. And I know that I miss Rhonda. I went down to see her, receive her endowed chair position. But I know that I miss her because when I drive by the parking lot where she used to park, I look for that license plate that said struggle, and it's gone. But I know wherever Rhonda is, she's engaged in the social justice struggle. And so our job is to continue the struggle as it has begun here. And so educating for struggle is how we've named every think tank. And that title reminds me, that theme that runs through each of our think tanks reminds me that Dr. King said, change does not roll in on wheels of inevitability. It's not inevitable. It's not just going to happen because people like you. It's going to happen because of struggle. It's going to happen because of change. We are beneficiaries of the fight against enslavement, beneficiaries of the civil rights movement, beneficiaries of the Black Power movement, beneficiaries of the women's movement, beneficiaries of the Stonewall movement, beneficiaries of the Standing Rock movement. And so there are several movements we could name. We are beneficiaries of people who have engaged in struggle. Didn't think it was going to happen just because people liked us. We knew it would entail struggle and a fight. And we, I believe now, more than ever before, are in a fight for our lives. We're in a fight for our very lives. So state violence then and now, we need to be able to acknowledge that it's happening now. Some people don't even want to acknowledge that this is state violence. What's happening in Flint, thank you, sister, for being here. What's happening in Flint, what's happening in Cleveland, the fact that we are still under a consent decree, regardless of whether you're talking about Cleveland or somewhere else, there's still the fear that we have that when we have an encounter with the police, it might not go right. The fact that we have to know that it might not go right, that we're still dealing with that form of state violence. And so there are other forms of state violence. Tim mentioned them in his letter that's in your booklet. I hope you'll read his letter, but there's all kinds of state violence we need to be aware of. And I'm so glad that in our breakout sessions today, we're going to hear about what kinds of actions people are taking. We can't just move into a woe is me. This is not a time for woe is me. This is not also a time to give in and feel hopeless. So the think tank brings us to a space of a clearing where we can think about how can I participate in the struggle? If I don't like the way state violence is affecting women's bodies, Black and brown bodies, poor people, then there's something that we can do. And when we come together like this, there are ways that we can protect our souls and our sanity. So I'm glad that you're here. I appreciate Tim Black asking me to be on the program this morning. And I just wanted to share one other way that I think you can be specific in your struggle. For a year, we've been acknowledging the work of Carl Stokes, the first Black mayor, and his brother Lou Stokes, who was a professor here at MSAS. And in this report, there is a response to his report 50 years ago. Carl Stokes wrote a report called Cleveland Now, and it focused on education, health, safety, housing, jobs, and employment. And so it's one thing, and I'm so grateful. I went up and hugged the brother. I've never met him before, Ibram Kendi. I hugged you because I appreciate the way you're helping us look at all of those categories: education, health, safety, housing, jobs, and employment. And when Carl Stokes wrote that report, he knew how much work was needed to be done. This report says there's still work that needs to be done. 50 years later, all 5 of those categories, I'm going to say them again: education, health, safety, housing, jobs, and employment. And so to simply say now that it's about diversity and inclusion is not enough. It is about diversity and inclusion, but the ways in which we have to talk about state violence and the way we have to name, it's going to take anti-racist work. Because when you look at all those categories, how do you explain that we haven't made progress in education, health, safety, housing, jobs, and employment that would erase the need for such a Social Justice Institute session? So it's not to deny progress. We have made progress, but as Dr. Kendi says in his book, we need to move on this anti-racist front, because as progress is made, the people who do not believe in progress, white supremacists, homophobic people, sexist people, you name all the ways that there are people who are still doubling down on oppressing people. So if we don't acknowledge that, we won't understand that it is a both and of acknowledging progress, but it is a moment to acknowledge that there are people who are engaged in state violence now more than ever. So I think I'm supposed to stop talking in a minute, but I just hope that you will go to the plenary sessions. And this evening we have a wonderful theater production, and it is my pleasure now to introduce Maxie Jackson, who's going to introduce our wonderful scholar.
So a few things before I get started, and it's really an honor to be here. I know any public speaker is trying to establish a sense of intimacy. That really is one of the goals. So I want to encourage you to move closer in. I know that's a big ask this morning, but if you don't mind coming a little closer in, I think it would make our speaker feel more comfortable, and I think you get a lot more out of the experience. So we got an issue here. You know, I tried to preserve some trees and not write my opening remarks on paper and use the technology. Problem is I didn't upgrade my phone, so it's not the big screen. And the other issue is, you know, as I get older, my sight goes a little bit. So bear with me, and let's hope that I can read what I've typed out on my little phone here. So to all the members of our community in the struggle, welcome to this morning's keynote presentation. Respect to Provost and Executive Vice President Baislick. Respect to Vice President Mobley. Respect to Interim Director Black, my dear friend Dr. Rhonda, and distinguished guests. It's an honor for me to participate in this, the biannual think tank of the Social Justice Institute. I was a little upset I wasn't invited last year, but then they told me it's biannual, so I'm at peace with it now. We all know that violence isn't just physical. Among the many forms of expression is violent policy. I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage you to partake in Idea Stream's week-long exploration of the history and future implications of housing segregation on Northeast Ohio. The multimedia experience is titled Divided by Design. With that PSA out of the way, now to this morning's presenter. He's a soul writer, a warrior in the struggle whose weapon is his pen, author of poignant publications addressing the nation's most intrinsic characteristic, racism. His assignment today addressed state violence with a nod to history and forward glance towards what we can individually and collectively do to be the struggle and speak truth not just to power, but to our colleagues, friends, and community. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the award-winning historian and New York Times best-selling author and professor of history and international relations and the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. His second book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, won the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction. Without further delay, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's truly an honor to be here. I am a huge admirer of Professor Rhonda Williams and what she built here with this Social Justice Institute. She's actually one of my favorite scholars. And so when I received this invitation from the Institute, of course, there's certain people you can't say no to, there's certain places you can't say no to, and certainly this is one of those places. And of course, there are institutions around the country who recognize what she has built, recognize her, how great of a scholar and activist she is. Vanderbilt is one of them. But again, I admire her particularly because I'm founding this center at American University, and of course I have a lot to learn about what has been done here. I also would like to thank Lisa for helping me and getting me to this point. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. This title of my talk, State Violence and the Anti-Racist Struggle, is quite the heavy topic, but we're living certainly in heavy times, and we've been living in heavy times for quite some time. You know, I can remember a few months before Rukia Boyd was shot and killed by an off-duty police officer in Chicago. And this was a month after Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. I can remember a few months before that, I decided one morning to throw on some sweatpants and a hoodie and head over to the bank, and I deposited a few small checks in the bank, and then I decided to go over to get a haircut. I still had my locks, but I wanted to get lined up a little bit, and so on the way to the barbershop, I decided to stop at a CVS. I was getting low on bathroom products, so I decided to get me some more toothpaste and some deodorant. And so I parked my car in the CVS parking lot, and I see that there's a police car that's literally parked right in front of the CVS. And of course, I'm thinking, as sure many of you would be thinking, okay, here we go, what's going on here? But I'm like, I'm just gonna go in and get my toothpaste and go on to the barbershop and get back home. And so I walk into the CVS, and you know, most of these CVSs have this huge sort of flat area near the front that sort of divides the registers from the aisle. So I was walking across the front of the area, and I rarely went to the CVS, so I didn't necessarily know where the toothpaste was. And so I was sort of looking up at the signs to the aisles, and then I sort of saw at the corner of my eye somebody was approaching me. And so of course I looked, and I saw a police officer approaching me. And mind you, I think it was kind of cold outside, so I walked in with my hands in the pouch of my sweatshirt, and because I went to Florida A&M for undergrad, and ever since I went to FAMU, coming back up north and trying to deal with this northern cold has been difficult for me. So, you know, I had my hands in my pouch. It was maybe only 40 degrees, but that's still too cold. And so I come upon this police officer who has his hand on his gun and tells me to take my hands out of my pocket. And so I'm like startled, and I ask him why. And then he tightens his hand on his gun and reorders me to take my hands out of my pocket. And I decide to slowly take my hands out of my pocket. And he sees that I don't have a gun or anything in my hands. And so he seems to ease up a little bit, but then orders me outside because he wanted to pat me down. So I go outside. He pats me down, and he asked me to get into the back of the police car. By this point, through him and I going back and forth, I realized, or he's told me that somebody was shooting in the area, and I, quote, fit the description. So as I'm sort of in his back seat of his car, and he's, quote, checking to see whether I'm the shooter, him and I are joying back and forth about some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today. Eventually, they realize that I'm not the shooter. By that point, that largely sort of deserted parking lot when I arrived is filled with cop cars. And so he finally lets me out of the back of the car, and I start sort of continuing the discussion with another police officer. This police officer now this cop was a short, white, somewhat larger male. This other police officer who they basically order to come and, quote, talk to me, is a black woman. And so her and I start joining back and forth, and basically what I'm saying to her is why, first and foremost, why is it that you have all of these officers here? Why is it that I am being treated this way? And why is it that you are so sensitive to this idea that I could or will hurt you? And so she states at one point that, well, a police officer a few weeks back was shot and killed by somebody in the community. And so then I respond, so when was the last time a police officer shot and killed somebody in the community? And so I'm sure everybody could sort of understand where this goes. So eventually, I leave and I go to the barbershop. And I am wearing a black hoodie and black sweatpants. And again, I am told that I fit the description. And so I arrive at the barbershop. And I, of course, by that point, because many of you know, if you get to the barbershop too late, you're going to wait. So, of course, I'm getting there, an hour later than I wanted to, which meant that there were 4 people waiting along the sort of front of the barbershop by the windows in chairs. And so I sit down next to these 4 brothers. And I look over and I see that they're all wearing a black top with some sort of black slacks or black pants. And so I think about how literally any one of the 5 of us would have, quote, fit the description. And depending on the way we responded to that police officer, any one of us could have been killed. And then any one of us could have been blamed for our own death. And so clearly I was lucky, to say the least, that I was able to say and do things that diffused the situation, because apparently it's our job as black people to diffuse the situations. And if we don't diffuse the situations, we are blamed for state violence against us. In the same way that women are supposed to diffuse situations when sexual predators are coming after them. And if they don't, they're somehow blamed for what happens. And so I wanted to sort of begin my talk sort of describing this. And the irony is, at the time, I think it was my first year as a professor, and I was teaching a course on mass incarceration. And so as you would imagine, I was able to take this story back to my students and unpack it. This was also this semester when we learned the name Troy Davis, if anybody knows or remembers who Troy Davis was. And so in writing this history of Stamped from this history of racist ideas entitled Stamped from the Beginning, I had to sort of come to grips with how is it that in the same moment in time, we could have a black president who was elected because you had the largest turnout of voters of people of color in American history, and you also had, and at the same time, you had the emergence of Black Lives Matter. Like, how could that simultaneously sort of happen? And I say that because I literally started writing this book not long after Trayvon Martin was killed. So the period in which I'm writing is between Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland. That's the period I'm sort of writing this book. And so what I realized was that our common historical conception of race, which is a conception that became ever more popular because of the election of Barack Obama, which is this conception of steady and forward and singular racial progress, is simply an incomplete way of understanding America's racial history. And what is incomplete about it is because we're not recognizing a second historical force. And that second historical force is racist progress. And so in Stamped from the Beginning, I chronicle a dueling history of race in America, a history of racial progress that has long been achieved as a result of the anti-racist struggle, and racist progress. That we've had a dual, and so if Barack Obama, for many of you, became the personification of racial progress, it would certainly make sense that the next person who came into the White House after him would become the personification of racist progress. Because typically, throughout American history, racist progress has followed racial progress. And so that's really the history that I show. However, Americans have largely been unable to see the march of racist progress because of racist ideas. And we have been unable to see the ever-sophistication of racist policies and racist ideas and state violence because of our consumption of racist ideas. And so that's where sort of racist ideas come into play. And that's why I think it was critical for me to show not only this history of racist ideas, but to show how once we digest of these racist ideas, it becomes quite easy for us to see the progression of racism. And I can say to you that we have to sort of understand the way racist ideas operate. And not only entering into this book, was I trying to sort of understand this conundrum of Barack Obama and Black Lives Matter in the same moment, but I was also trying to sort of understand the origins of racist ideas. And I was trying to sort of understand whether it was the case that people who were producing racist ideas to normalize state violence, to blame black people who were the victims of state violence, to whether those racist ideas were the result of ignorance. Whether it was the case that the political community police officers, law enforcement do not understand, do not know the ways in which their policies and their people are violating black bodies on a daily basis. Whether slave owners or their politicians did not know the ways in which state violence was crucial in the maintenance of slavery. Or we're also told that those perpetrators of state violence perpetrate state violence or defend state violence because they hate black people. They hate people of color. And so that's the sort of common sort of story of the cradle of racist ideas, that really racist ideas are coming out of ignorance and hate. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And then we're taught that it's these people who have racist ideas are the people who institute racist policies, whether those racist policies are slavery, segregation, or the policies that led to the carceral state. That it's racist ideas that's behind those policies, that Johnson and Nixon and Reagan launched this war on drugs because they had racist ideas. That's the narrative that we're largely taught. And so I asked the question simply, why? Why were they producing these ideas? And was it the case that these people were ignorant and hateful? And I found over and over again that that was not the case. And the way that I ended up finding that was, very importantly, distinguishing between the producers of racist ideas, the people who produced the idea that young black people are super predators, versus the people who consumed those ideas. And I wanted to sort of understand, why were these people producing those racist ideas that stated that black people were super predators, which unleashed state violence against those predators? I wanted to understand why. And I found that, again, these people were not ignorant and hateful. I found that historically people have been producing racist ideas to defend existing racist policies. And those racist policies have largely been emanating out of political, economic, and cultural self-interest. And so I found this history of self-interest driving the creation of racist policies, and then the need to defend those policies driving the creation of racist ideas, and then people consuming those racist ideas, leading to the massive amounts of ignorance and hate. And so that's the story that I tell in Stand From the Beginning. And one of the ways we can understand that is very simply when you have a racial disparity. And so to give an example, between 2010 and 2012, young black males were 22 times more likely to be killed by police than young white males. When you have a racial disparity, there's only two causes of a racial disparity, any racial disparity, whether that racial disparity or the racial disparity that 40% of the incarcerated population in this country right now is black, or that black women are making up the highest. They're primarily going into prison at a faster rate than any other racial group. There's only two causes of racial disparities. Either there's something wrong or inferior about the group of people on the lower end of the racial disparity, or something superior about the other group. In other words, either it's the case that the reason why young white males are 22 times less likely to be killed by police than young black males is because young white males interact better with the police at a rate of 22 times higher. So there's something about the people, or discrimination. Any racial disparity, those are the only two causes. You take over the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate. There's only two causes. Either there's something wrong with black workers, they're lazy, they're unqualified, they want to hang out on welfare, or job discrimination. Those are the only two causes. So let's say if you are a job discriminator and you benefit from the policies of job discrimination, and you don't want nobody challenging those policies, what are you going to do? You're going to create or reproduce ideas suggesting that the problem is not your policies. The problem is black people. The same thing in the realm of state violence. If you, because you own or you have stock in a private prison, and you see these huge disparities in the number of black people being incarcerated, and it benefits you to mass incarcerate people because the more people who are incarcerated, the more money you can make, you're going to create or reproduce ideas suggesting that these people should be mass incarcerated. Because what that does is it causes the people to see black people as the problem as opposed to your policies which benefit you. And so that's the history that I show in Stand from the Beginning. And I also show the ways in which the most lethal racist policy historically has very simply been state violence. It's been a critical racist policy. And one of the ways we can understand the role of state violence historically is when racist Americans seek to depress, exclude, exploit black bodies, and they create a series of racist policies to do so. And then they simultaneously create racist ideas to substantiate those policies. And not only to substantiate those policies, to even make black people believe they should be incarcerated at a greater rate, make black people believe they should be enslaved. But when those policies of enslavement and those racist ideas trying to convince black people that because of your skin you should be a slave do not work, and people still resist, and people still engage in the anti-racist struggle against those policies, against those ideas, racist violence, state violence becomes critical. State violence has historically been critical. So that's why we, of course, are quite familiar with the role of state violence, of racist violence during slavery, to suppress the anti-racist struggle for freedom. But we're not as familiar with the way in which the critical role of state violence continued even though slavery, at least chattel slavery, ended. And most of us can understand it when we begin to think about it. State violence was critical in devastating black politicians during Reconstruction America, in devastating and destroying, particularly in communities that did not have a large black population, black voters. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist and terrorist groups were critical. And those groups remain critical through lynching thousands of people who were not lynched because they were raping people, but they were lynched because they were involved in the anti-racist struggle, whether through their own personal interactions of simply unwilling to sort of bow down to a racist white person in their midst, or simply demanding wages for the work they had engaged in, or involved literally in an organization. These were the people who were most likely, or even having something as simple as land, or a good, thriving business. These are the people who were lynched. These are the people who were subjected to state violence. And I say state violence because the people who were either engaged in the lynching or defending the lynching were members of the state. And when I say members of the state, I'm not just talking about, quote, Southern sheriffs. I'm even talking about presidents of the United States, whether you want to talk about Woodrow Wilson, who hailed the Ku Klux Klan in his work, or whether you want to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, who spoke in 1906 about the fact that lynching is a natural response of black raping and criminality. And so at the highest levels of government, you had the state endorsing lynching. And we know the state endorsed lynching because the state never passed a bill to abolish or to try to basically stamp out lynching. As late as the 1930s, Theodore Bilbo, a senator from Mississippi who was involved in a filibuster of the anti-lynching bill, stated to his colleagues that if we pass this bill, black on white rape will increase 1,000-fold. And this is what, again, you create a racist idea, or you reproduce a racist idea to substantiate racist violence, which are substantiating these racist policies that benefit you. Because Theodore Bilbo knew that if ever black people had the chance to vote in Mississippi, he would simply be out of a job. And so lynching and state violence was critical to his own political self-interest. In the same way that the planters that he represented knew that if black people had economic justice in their midst, they would simply not have this cheap labor pool that they can continue to exploit. I'm sorry, I'm a little riled up. And so I'm trying to sort of show you this interrelationship between racist policies and racist ideas and state violence. And I think one of the more critical racist ideas that have substantiated and normalized state violence historically throughout the history of this country is the pervasive idea of the dangerous black person and the dangerous black community. And when I say an old idea, I'm talking as far back as the Salem witch trials. A Salem witch trial, which typically in popular media is sanitized away from its racial overtones, in which you had the accusers, the people who were stating that they were being bewitched either by people or the devil's machinations or people on earth, were typically classifying the devil as a black man or black, and typically classifying the people who were bewitching them as black. Because in a larger sense, throughout the development of the scientific revolution and in the Enlightenment era, there became this connection between blackness and the devil. And of course, we understand the connection in Christian countries between the devil and what? Criminality. And so I try to chronicle sort of this interrelationship that people have between blackness and the devil that was critical in the development of modern Western thought. And that then led to this critical interrelationship between blackness and danger, or black people and violence and criminality. And that, of course, only continued and continues up to this day, in which most people believe that black neighborhoods are more dangerous than white neighborhoods. That when they see a large concentration of black people living in a neighborhood, they believe that that's the most dangerous place. And when I say people, I mean even black people. And how do they justify this? Well, before they were justifying it by using the Bible or using science. Now, ever since the 1890s, Americans have been justifying the idea of dangerous black neighborhoods based on crime statistics, stating that, well, it is factually correct that more black people are arrested and incarcerated, and that there's a concentration of people in this black neighborhood who are being arrested and incarcerated, so that must mean that there's more criminality in that neighborhood, and that must mean that black people have an inclination towards crime. Now, where does this inclination come from? Well, over the last 60 years, they've been making the case it's the result of the broken black family, that these people are coming out of these broken sort of homes, and that's, they of course have bad parents who are not teaching them the decencies of justice and order. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And the irony is, I'm oftentimes asked about this. Well, isn't it the case that, 73% of or 75% of black children are born in single-parent households. And typically my response is, personally, if I had a choice between 2 bad parents and 1 good one, I would choose 1 good one every single time. But this assumption that somehow if you have 2 parents, and you can even have 2 good parents, but they're not 2 good parents together, that somehow there's some sort of relationship between having 1 parent and being a criminal. But, so we believe somehow that there's a relationship also between arrest rates and actual crime rates. Arrest rates and actual crime rates. In other words, everyone apparently who commits a crime is arrested, right? Isn't that the case? Oh, I'm sorry, it's not the case? But if we make this razor sharp line between arrest rates and incarceration rates, that means that we assume that everybody who gets arrested, everybody who commits a crime is getting arrested. We also assume that everyone who gets arrested is incarcerated, that there's nothing between that. There's nothing that benefits certain people who have access to lawyers, who have access to the innocent face of whiteness. That doesn't matter. We also then say, okay, yes, all right, I understand that, but it is the case that you have all these black people who are selling drugs and who are taking drugs. People don't say that as much now because of the opioid crisis, right? And of course, it's considered an opioid crisis and a public health emergency because of the face of this, right? 20 years ago or 40 years ago when there was a heroin, quote, problem in black communities, there, of course, was a different response. It allowed the Nixon administration to launch its war on drugs. So there was, of course, a different response. But we also don't know that studies show that the racial groups consume and sell drugs at similar rates. If anything, studies show that white people are more likely to consume and sell drugs. And so why is it that black people are far more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for selling or consuming drugs? Well, I would say discriminatory policy. When you have a concentration of drug enforcement units in black and poor communities, that serially you have police, you're gonna have arrest. You have arrest, you're gonna have incarceration. But then people say, okay, all right, I got that stuff, but when it comes to state violence, as the Heather McDonald would say in her book, The War on Cops, the reason why there's a higher concentration of black people, higher percentage of black people being killed by police is because black people are committing more crime, violent crime. That's what she says, that's the prevailing argument from racist America. They are more violent, and so that's precisely why they are more subjected to state violence. Now, when we unpack that, and I think that is generally the reason why people think that black neighborhoods are more dangerous than white neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods have more violent crime than white neighborhoods, we are taught. And what's interesting, I just came from Atlanta, and Atlanta has not only poor black communities, but quite wealthy black neighborhoods as well. Anybody been to any of those black wealthy neighborhoods in and around the Atlanta region? And what we should understand is that when you say that black neighborhoods are more dangerous, what you're saying is that any neighborhood that is black is going to have similar levels of violent crime, because you're making a direct correlation between blackness and violent crime. But that doesn't actually turn out to be the case. And so among black middle and upper income neighborhoods, they typically have lower levels of violent crime, just like in white America, you have white middle-income neighborhoods having lower levels of violent crime than neighborhoods with higher levels of unemployment. Why is that? Because across racial groups, we see relationships between higher unemployment levels and higher levels of violent crime. And so what that causes me to think about is, you know what? There really is no such thing as a dangerous black neighborhood, but there is a such thing as a dangerous unemployed neighborhood. But can you imagine if we conceived of the issue, the fundamental issue, not as blackness, but of unemployment, then the resulting solution is simply not going to be civilizing or incarcerating the people. The resulting solution is something as simple as Ron, I'm sure, has been calling for in Cleveland, more jobs. More, not just more jobs, good jobs. But of course, those who benefit from the lack of jobs in those communities, those who benefit from the mass incarceration of those people, those who benefit from the mass disenfranchisement of those incarcerated people, why would they ever promote a job campaign, a war against unemployment, as a direct solution to violent crime? Why would they do that? And so I'm saying this to say that really, if we truly are going to be against state violence, we cannot simultaneously believe one of the prevailing ideas that maintains or justifies state violence, which is the dangerous black neighborhood. We can't hold them both. And I see many people who are even involved in social justice work still decrying this, quote, problem of black on black crime. And then they want to call themselves activists. Because when you say the problem is black on black crime, well, you know, black people are killing themselves, then you're fundamentally saying, who is the problem? Black people. Or what you're actually doing is you're saying there's two problems. You're saying that the problem is black people and racial discrimination. And I mention that because the last sort of thing I want to talk about is in this book, in Stand From the Beginning, I chronicle a three-way debate about race in America. I chronicle two kinds of racist ideas. And the kind of racist idea that will simultaneously say the problem is discrimination and the problem is black people is what I call assimilationist ideas. And I show the ways in which those assimilationist ideas have largely been in argument with segregationist ideas, another kind of racist idea, a kind that principally says that the problem is black people. And I show the ways in which those two kinds of racist ideas have constantly been challenged by anti-racist ideas. Anti-racist ideas that say there's nothing wrong with black people and that there's everything wrong with discrimination. And so I show this sort of three-way debate over the course of American history, trying to explain why do we have state violence against black bodies, trying to explain why do we have racial disparities in nearly every sector of this country. And again, there's three answers. Segregationists say it's because of black inferiority. Anti-racists say because of its discrimination. Assimilationists say, well, it's both. And we were engaged, and we still largely are engaged in this three-way debate over race and state violence. The segregationist position has largely been the Blue Lives Matter position. That there, if anything, there's a war against cops. And if anything, the cops are the greatest saviors of black people. And they're the greatest saviors of black people because black people are so violent. And they're so violent to each other. And they're so violent to each other because their families are so broken. And they come from this subculture of violence. And they have these poverty values that they continue to pass on. And then that results in their violent behavior, which can either be civilized or incarcerated, and police officers are trying to do both, while simultaneously saving their lives. This is the Blue Lives Matter position. And in the course of saving their lives, they too often get killed themselves. And so what we need to focus is on their lives. And of course, that line of thinking has long been rejected by the Black Lives Matter position, which states that there's a war on Black lives. And there has historically been a war on Black lives ever since Black people were herded into this country. And that Black people do not have any problem. That you have Black people who commit crimes just like you have white people who commit crimes. You have violent Black people just like you have white violent Black people. That there's nothing inherently inferior about Black people. But these disparities that allow violent white men to stay in the common sort of population out of prison and then allow them to continue to mass murder people, that these policies are racist. And that's the fundamental problem. And that the reason why people don't see that is because they don't value Black lives. And then, of course, the all lives matter position, which I argue is the assimilationist position, states, you know what, it's both. There is a war on cops, but there's also a war on Black lives. There is a problem with policing, but there's also a problem with Black people. We do need to civilize the criminal justice system, but we also need to civilize Black people. And because there's a war on both, we need to recognize that all lives matter. And so we've been engaged in the same three-way debate ever since slavery. Ever since you had slave owners saying that the barbarians are these people who are engaged in slave revolts. The barbarians are these people who continue to kill or even run away to the north. They are the barbarians. And why don't you care about the lives of slaveholders who they are harming through running away or who they are hurting through resisting their violence? And of course, you had people in the enslaved community and their allies outside of it trying to point the spotlight on the persisting violence of slave owners who were actually sustaining slavery. In that they were asking the question, why don't Black lives matter? How can we continue to allow a fundamentally violent institution to sustain itself? And then you, of course, had this middling position, the position of too many white abolitionists. A middling position that stated that, yes, there is a problem. There is a problem with violence within slavery, but there's also a problem in the way you enslaved people continue to resist. And so what we need to focus on is more traditional forms of resistance. And you need to allow us, as William Lloyd Garrison told Frederick Douglass, to lead the struggle. And so, we've been engaged in this for quite some time. And I just wanted to sort of speak to you for a few minutes about that historically and even today, what has deeply challenged the anti-racist struggle has been state violence. And of course, we are in a moment in which anti-racists have been officially described as extremists by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, Black identity extremist, which gives license to the FBI, to the law enforcement community, to unleash state violence against these people in the same way COINTELPRO did against Black Power 50 years ago. And what was interesting, for the lack of a better term, was, of course, one of our Representative Bass, recently interrogated the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, on how is it that you're writing this report, you're identifying these people as a problem, but you're not simultaneously identifying Ku Klux Klan members and other white supremacist organizations as a problem. And I think we really need to think about the fact that the majority of Americans in the last few years who have been subjected to terror have been subjected to white male terror, that Americans are more likely to die at the hands of somebody with white supremacist beliefs than they are somebody who is a member of ISIL. And then the state hasn't focused on disrupting those organizations or even identifying those organizations as terrorist organizations, and they focused their efforts on anti-racists. And you think that we're living in a different time than 1850. 1850, when the state passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which focused its efforts on people resisting and running away from slavery as opposed to those slaveholders who were maintaining slavery through violence. And we're defending it by saying, as Senator John C. Calhoun stated in 1837, that slavery is a positive good. That slavery is good for black people, which is precisely what Mayor Giuliani said after Black Lives Matter. How could you be challenging police officers? They are good for black people. I mean, it's the same argument. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. Eloquent, beautiful, and harsh at the same time. We appreciate that. I want to, first of all, invite members of the audience to begin queuing up, because I think we'll get a lot more value if we get audiences from an informed community than just me. So please do that. I wanted to start, though, because, and let me qualify this question a little bit. A Western approach to solving problems often is symptomological, whereas an Eastern approach sometimes, I would hope more times than not, is getting to the root cause of things. So in much of what you said today, there's this question of white patriarchy. What's at the soul of that that's causing these systems to be structured, if you get my question?
Well, I'm not necessarily, I would say that at the heart of assimilationist thought is focusing on simultaneously on symptoms and root causes.
Okay.
And assimilationist thought, as many of you would imagine, has largely dominated liberal thought. And so when you're talking about Western liberal thought,
Yeah.
Western liberals have primarily put as much focus on the symptoms as they have the root causes. And I think it's partly because of the recognition among the producers of the very systems that Western liberalism has created that benefit them. And so they don't want to undermine those systems. They don't want to get at the root cause if I'm benefiting from those roots themselves. And so instead, they, of course, those put a focus on the symptoms. I should also say that I think one of the ways in which the American project in particular has sort of been able to capture so many minds is because, like, how do you build a nation based on freedom that enslaves so many people? Well, the way you very simply do it is by recognizing that there are two definitions of freedom. And you allow power to have its definition of freedom, and the powerless to have its own definition of freedom. And what I mean by that is, for power, they want the freedom to exploit, enslave, oppress, incarcerate. And of course, the people who are incarcerated and oppressed want the freedom to not have to deal with that anymore. And so both are talking about freedom. And I think what I'm saying is this sort of, what we see as a contradiction actually according to Western liberal thought, is quite foundational.
Thank you for that. Let's go straight to the Q&As.
Yes, thank you so much. Haven't seen your book yet, but we all need to do that. I just want to pose I'm coming up here saying if I agree with most everything you've said, which I think I do, there's still a problem. And I'll start this by saying a few blocks west of here on a road called Carnegie, there was Lancers, a restaurant and bar where Carl Stokes organized his mayor race, and Louis Stokes, when he got elected, had a Monday meeting called the 21st Congressional Caucus. And at that meeting, anybody from the neighborhood who had a problem would walk in and pose their problem, and Louis and his local organization would then try to solve a police violence problem, whatever. And so that was where the local people went. Now, that isn't done anymore. The district has been reorganized. There's new leaders. But there's a new organization starting after that called Black on Black Crime. And this is what I want to throw at you here. I've been going to that for some 10 years, and it's very much like the 21st Congressional Caucus. While I was there, I saw half a dozen to a dozen people bring their problems in the door with police violence, with neighborhood violence, whatever, and these people tried to solve it. And so if all politics are local, the people there in Black on Black Crime would probably tell you we don't have the luxury of the long run or the big picture. And this is what you've talked about today. And I don't know if anybody from Black on Black Crime is here today to help me, but they would say that they're of the neighborhood, they've taken responsibility, they're the ones that led the local Tamir Rice protests along with several other groups, and so they're at the forefront of fighting for racial justice, and yet their organization, and the other thing is they had a wall of sour arrows which was taken down, and it has the names of 1,000 young black men primarily who have been killed in local black on black violence, and that's what they go and try to save kids from. And so, and I don't think they are blaming black people, and I wonder if you could, I think if anybody else, is there anyone here from Black on Black who could help me? But if not, I think I'm representing the picture accurately. And so this is a local place where people go for help, and it's called Black on Black Crime, and they did that consciously. And what do you have to say about that?
Sure. So I'm not denying from what you're stating the good work that these people are doing, but what I am referencing is why can't that organization be entitled the Crime Project? Or why can't that organization be entitled the Crime Project? And so if the issue is sort of figuring out ways to reduce violent crime in this black community, when you make the issue about blackness as opposed to crime, you simultaneously reinforce the idea that's circulating around the country that the focus needs to be somehow on developing and civilizing the people, as opposed to thinking systematically in the community about the root causes of that problem that don't involve stating that there's something wrong with the people. I would also add that, as you will read in Stand from the Beginning, that abolitionists were well-meaning, but they were led to believe, and many of them made this case, that slavery had literally imbruted black people, that black people were brutes. And so it's not just what abolitionists don't just need to do is eliminate slavery, they literally need to civilize these people away from being brutes. Civil rights activists, some civil rights activists thought that not only was racial discrimination a problem, but the existence of black spaces were a problem. Yep. And so they thought that the way to better individual black people was to figure out ways to usher them into superior white spaces. Yep. And they were very well-meaning in that respect, as opposed to figuring out ways to equalize the resources and opportunities of all spaces. And so I think I wanted to sort of show how assimilationist thought has largely been well-meaning and has largely operated within organizations that consider themselves to be liberal, even progressive, and even radical. That there are radical racist ideas.
Sure.
Yeah, I have more of a sort of a statement than a question. The thing that you're talking about is at the core of this talk, to me, is the criminalization of blacks, or the so-called criminalization of blacks. And there is another author, Khalid Muhammad, who wrote a book called Condemnation of Blackness, which describes that history coming out of the 19th century, how people have been shaped, even in academia, to think and assimilate those ideas.
Oh, yeah.
That there's something inherently wrong with black people, but then right at the cusp of that, here comes Jane Addams, just like the heroine of, oh, it's a social issue. We need more jobs. We need better housing. And see, the thing you're talking about is how this disparity of how we can sort of kind of either see this about black people or pretend not to see it, and at the same time say it's a health issue when it's talking about white people. The other book I want to recommend is the Invention of the White Race by Theodore Allen. It's in 2 volumes. That also goes into some of this history in terms of origin.
Thank you.
Before we go to that question, I want to piggyback on this just a little bit. How important, well, let me say, in some of your writings, you articulate this notion that education and love are not the answer alone. And I know it's a lot more sophisticated response that you can provide to that statement. But I was one of those people until I heard some of your comments and really understood what you meant by this, that education was the issue, that a lot of it was based on ignorance, a lot of the racist policy and activity. In line with that, how important is it for us to tell the true and accurate understanding of world history so that we don't carry some of these negative connotations about black folk or being black or blackness?
Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of, I think everybody can understand that if we distinguish the producers from the consumers, we recognize that the producers of racist ideas are typically the people who are in positions of power or who are defending people in positions of power. And if they are creating those ideas as essentially propaganda for racist policies or self-interest, that our efforts to educate them away are futile efforts. I mean, that's like us, you know, a company has a harmful product, and us trying to basically educate the executives of that company that that product is harmful. They already know it's harmful. I mean, they were behind its creation. They know exactly what it does to the body, right? And so I think that's what I was trying to sort of show. That doesn't mean that the people who are consuming that product or consuming racist ideas, they can and should be educated away from believing that that product is actually good for them, that milk does a body good, to give an example. Like you know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't show people how these very pervasive ideas are not true. And so I think we should shift, we should not think that power can be educated away from its self-interest. And then in terms of, very quickly, you know, world history and world knowledge, I mean, Malcolm X, one of his, I think, more famous quotes is, you know, you can't love the tree and hate the roots. I'm really butchering the statement, but he talked about how you had black people in the United States who would talk about that they loved black people, but they hated Africa.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or, and we also know the ways in which within sort of what I talk about in the book is ethnic racism, in which you have this huge hierarchy of black ethnic groups, in which African Americans think they're superior to continental Africans, and the continental Africans think they're superior to African Americans, and African Americans think they're superior to West Indians, and West Indians think they're superior to African Americans, and light-skinned blacks think they're superior to dark-skinned, and dark-skinned think they're superior. I mean, you know, you have all these sort of ideas that I think pervade, in which we're using whiteness as the standard and measuring all of these different groups from those standards. And I think that is also, to me, a function of racist ideas. Finally, race is a global construct. And so we can't really understand race if we don't understand its global dimensions.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to just hear you talk. I know it's not off the cuff, but you gave us the good stuff, and I appreciate that in Cleveland. And I'm a professor, and some of our students from Oberlin are here in the house, and I was really glad to see them. And my question has to do with that, actually. I see the progress of the racist ideas as really insidious and a great momentum to it. And I'm trying to teach young people and try to keep the ideas out of my head and out of my teaching and interrupt them in the workplace. And if it's affecting us in a elite academic institution, well, even as I said that, of course it's affecting us, right? In that kind of institution. I'm reminded of the old idea, Althusser and different people have said that ideology is like a dream. It's like a dream state settling on you. So you don't know when you're in that unreality of thinking, right? And so my question really is, concretely, are there any tips you can give us to how to keep that dream from settling in our heads? Because it doesn't stop. It's not like once you educate yourself out of it, the dream doesn't keep coming back on you. Just reading the newspaper, the plain dealer, for God's sake, I have a love-hate relationship or hate-hate relationship with it, because I feel like I have a clear head and then I read the plain dealer and it's like, whoa, your version of the Q deal is so different from what I was thinking, what I taught myself to think. So my question is, concretely, how can we help the young people and ourselves to not take in these ideas? Thank you.
Sure. So I'm actually working on a book right now entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think it talks very concretely about how to sort of adopt a more anti-racist mentality after being raised and showered our whole lives by these racist ideas in this country. And so I'm actually working through that now. But a few things that I can say very briefly is, first and foremost, that to think as an anti-racist is to simply think that the racial groups are equal. But that doesn't necessarily mean you think or strive for the racial groups to be the same. That means they're on the same level. And so you don't necessarily look at difference and see inferiority. You also, when you think about equality, you're not thinking about equality from these extremely talented sort of black people. Like, not everybody can be Rhonda Williams, right? And the way that you think about it is through the imperfections of the racial groups. That when you think of group equality, you recognize that within every racial group there's a gradation, and just like there is within every individual, right? You have your lazy days and your non-lazy days, where you have your lazy people who are lazy, and so that's within all the groups. And so I encourage people to think about, to not strive for perfection, just like you shouldn't be looking for perfection in black people. That you should accept imperfections as a representation of humanity, and that when you see imperfections in any racial group, you're seeing their humanity, and you're equalizing that to the humanity within yourself as well as other racial groups. And so really, you shouldn't be striving as a black person to be, this super black, extraordinary black person. You should just be striving to be yourself. And if somebody looks upon that time in which you exhibit that negative quality as a manifestation of your, quote, negative blackness, they're the problem, not you. And so I talk in the book about what I call uplift suasion, and that is, black people and people of color being taught that we need to sort of, by our own positive, uplifting sort of actions and behaviors, sort of persuade away the racist ideas of white people. What we don't realize is that's based on a racist idea, that somehow we're responsible for the racist ideas white people have about us. We also don't recognize that when we do defy all of those stereotypes, they don't say, okay, you know what? The racial groups are equal. No, they call you extraordinary.
Right.
You're not like those ordinary, inferior black people. You're an exception. You're an exception to the rule of inferiority. And then, not only that, when you then do become that extraordinary black person, you get subjected to, historically, state violence.
Thank you.
I'm a Cleveland public school teacher. We exchanged a note about interpretations of To Kill a Mockingbird a while back, which I appreciate you responding. I have long struggled with standardized testing and how it fits into that sequence that you describe of racial self or economic self-interest, race. You know the sequence I'm talking about. I'm just wondering where you think it sits in that sequence.
Sure. So, most of you know, standardized tests is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The test prep industry is an even bigger industry. There's a huge lobbying force, like any industry, that's seeking to maintain and proliferate the existence of standardized tests. That's why that lobbying industry was excited after George Bush passed his No Child Left Behind Act, and the Obama administration continued and expanded it. And what I should say, that standardized tests primarily defend this idea that black children are intellectually inferior. And so we, of course, even racial reformers believe in the such thing as an achievement gap, that white children and Asian children are achieving at a higher level than black and Latino children, and that therefore what schools, parents, and communities need to do is basically civilize these underachieving black children. And again, this notion is based on standardized tests. But when we look at standardized tests, what they actually measure, they measure that somebody can take a test well. That's it. They also were created by eugenicists. Eugenicists who created these tests to prove that black people, that people from Ireland and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, women, Southern people, poor people, all of these groups were by nature genetically, intellectually inferior. And so when they did these first standardized tests during World War I, and all of these, quote, groups, whether black people or Southern people or poor people or non-Anglo-Saxons got lower scores, the creator said, you see, this shows that they are genetically inferior. So then by the 60s, of course, eugenics had largely been discredited, had become marginal, and so then what defenders of the achievement gap said, okay, that achievement gap is not based on nature, it's based on nurture. It's based on black people having inferior teachers, having inferior schools, having inferior parents, not demanding or desiring education as much as other groups. And so that's the period that we're in which educational reformers are entering into their work thinking that there's something wrong with black children, as opposed to diversifying our sense of intelligence and recognizing that something like intelligence is like beauty. It cannot be standardized.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Dallas. I'm with the Radical Student Union here on campus. I just wanted to thank you so much for being here. This is one of the best events I think I've seen in my time at Case, so I'm really excited for this weekend and all of the stuff that's going on. Going throughout college, I've kind of heard this notion that I'm hoping you could speak to a little bit that I found kind of troubling, which is this idea I've heard from my parents, I've heard from other peers on campus that a lot of racist tendencies, I'll say, quote unquote, will go away with time, and that there's this idea that younger people are somehow more accepting or more tolerant or more understanding of racial difference. And so I kind of get this pushback a lot with, why are you pushing this? Just wait until people get older, and like these younger generations will just be, more tolerant of one another. And I of course think that this is absurd, and I'm just wondering what you would say kind of in response to those kinds of notions.
So the short answer is that in the 60s, it was said the same thing about young white people. And I'm sure everybody can imagine, you had this huge anti-war movement, you had this huge progressive movements and many different vantage points, so people were like, hey, look, these people are progressive, then, these problems and we have the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, so everything within a generation will be fine. Clearly, that turned out to not be the case. It was said during the radical Republican period. That was also said. What we don't realize is that the statistics and surveys, I should say the surveys that people utilize to make that case are typically surveys that look for segregationist ideas. And so it's very rare that these surveys seek to analyze the pervasiveness of assimilationist ideas among young people. I should also say that for us to simply say, well, just wait. I mean, that's precisely what King was challenging in his letter from the Birmingham jail, right? You know, and so, and also it is so, it lacks so much empathy for the people who are standing and sitting and laying and incarcerated under the foot of racial discrimination right now.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, Dr. Kendi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for delivering this very powerful as well as informative talk this morning. And I would also like to say I really am impressed by what I've read thus far in your book. As I was listening to you just detail the historical arc that has taken place in America, I was really fascinated by the fact that you pinpointed this duality in terms of racial progress, as well as the, I guess, irony in the fact that we have racist progress, and that you pinpointed the fact that the manifestation of that, in fact, is our sitting president in terms of the latter. I was also thinking in regards to what Du Bois discussed regarding the Sisyphus syndrome. You know, whereas we're pushing this boulder of racial equality up this hill of American democracy predicated on our, let's say, our stake in this democratic republic with our rights and things of that nature, but only to find out that in every instance when we're making progress, so-called progress, there's something known in colloquial terms as the white backlash. You discussed that quite well when you delineated about the Reconstruction era in terms of the rhetoric that was being used to justify the pervasive racist ideas. And so when I was listening to all of the aspects of the thesis of your book, one thought came to mind, because when you talked about self-interest, I thought that was really a metaphor for just economic power. And so as African Americans in this country, we know the statistics in terms of our economic well-being. So my question to you is, first of all, we're in an uber capitalist country. And if we, as a people in aggregate, our possession of capital is at a very low, let's just say, as not sustainable in the long run in terms of our sense of well-being without being considered as pariahs and things of that nature, as far as when we look at the propaganda, again, the racist propaganda. The heart of my question is, in short, what are your views on collectivism versus the ideological view of the westernized ideological view, that is, of individualism, which doesn't seem to necessarily be in our best interests?
So I think that to sort of complicate this duality of individualism versus collectivism even more is, I think what racist ideas do is it causes people, even black people, to simply not even do what's in their individual self-interest. So I don't even need people to develop we don't need people to develop a collectivist mentality. We don't need people to be altruistic. What we need people to do, even white people, middle income, poor white people, to do is to recognize what's in their own sort of self-interest. And if people were to recognize that racism, that racist policies, just like other forms of bigotry, is simply not in their self-interest, then they would challenge it. But what racist ideas do is it sort of develops what I call in the book unintelligent self-interest. And so you think you are supporting a particular economic or political project out of self-interest, when in fact you're not. To give an example, when I was on the plane yesterday coming here, these two white guys sitting behind me were critiquing young people. They talked about data that shows that a large percentage of young people look upon socialism as favorable. And they, of course, these are two older white guys, had serious problems with that. And the end of their discussion, one of the guys said, and these were, I think, two middle-income white guys. They were sitting behind me in coach. They stated that, you know, what these young people don't realize is that these rich people will lead us to prosperity.
Wow.
Right. That's what they said. And so, because they have been led to believe by those very rich people that if you give us a tax break, we'll create jobs for you. As opposed to hoard more of the resources of corporations. And so that's what I'm talking about. Like, I agree with you. I mean, ideally, you know, we would be able to be empathetic. We would be able to develop a collective mentality. We would be able to think about what's best for other people before we think about what's best for ourselves. We don't even need all of that. We just need people to think about what's in their economic and political self-interest.
Thank you.
A little more critical thinking, it sounds like. I do want to build on something, or ask you to address something you spoke about. You talked about racial progress always being followed by racist progress, this sort of back and forth. It sounds like we've been playing checkers for a long time in this country. How do we get to playing chess?
Well, I think by realizing that when you institute an anti-racist policy, that those who simply do not benefit from that, and those who benefited from the racist policy that you smashed and eliminated, are simply going to go back to the drawing board and figure out new and more sophisticated racist policies, and they're going to then create a propaganda campaign of racist ideas to substantiate those policies. And so if you know that, then you will expect that, right? You won't think that the struggle, you know, has ended. I mean, you know, there's a reason why we talk about the word struggle, because we realize that it's not simply going to end when you have the 13th Amendment. No, that people are going to try to re-enslave these people by another name, to quote Douglas Blackman, right? And so I think for us to recognize that, and we've seen this over the last 40 years, if not the last 10 years, in which, you know, you had, after the Voting Rights Act passed, you know, you had in the 1980s, you know, people beginning to talk about things like voter fraud, and those whispers of voter fraud in the 1980s to be used to create new voter ID laws continued to sort of build, and eventually, after the election of Barack Obama, but more specifically after the massive amount of young people and people of color who voted, that then led to a frontlash. And when I say frontlash very specifically, because when you think backlash, you consistently think that you're just going backwards. No, these people are, like, they are trying to move forward. Like, progress, they see voter ID laws as more sophisticated than than poll taxes, as grandfather clauses, as new and more sophisticated ways to suppress voters. And then they were able to get these laws in place because the Supreme Court justices imagined that this nation was post-racial, and which of course was another project, ideological project. And then what happened? You had states like Wisconsin, in which some studies show that 200,000 people's votes were suppressed, and Trump won by 22,000 votes. And who knows how many votes were suppressed in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Florida, where in Florida 1 out of 4 black men are disenfranchised. And if those men were enfranchised, then it would not be a purple state, it would be a blue state. Who knows how many black people are disenfranchised or their votes are suppressed in Ohio, in which if that wasn't the case, this would not be a swing state? I mean, this is the sophistication of these policies, and I think we have to recognize that that's simply going to continue to sort of happen, and that people are simply not going to go home to their golf courses in New Jersey and Palm Beach County. If y'all know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Chrissy Stoberger Martinez, and I'm a queer Colombian Appalachian femme. And I say that not because it's my perspective is more important, but because it's important to state a little bit of the context of where where I'm coming from with my perspective. I run a human rights organization here in Cleveland called the Interreligious Task Force on Central America and Colombia, and my staff is 3/5 Latin American, centering the people that we are trying to work to uplift, and yet the majority of my board has subsumed to whiteness, or at least I can assume that they have subsumed to whiteness, and can therefore, in my opinion, not fully identify or understand the struggle that I and other staff members have experienced or are trying to center and uplift. So, my question is, how do we demand reparations for Afro-descendant and indigenous people without conceding to whiteness and folks who think that they own the money that they hoard? And a little bit more, do you have any more specific ideas on how to move away from our dependency on capitalism and environmental exploitation to move toward this anti-racist, anti-violence, anti-patriarchal society? I want to restate that. How do we demand reparations for Afro-descendant and indigenous people without conceding to whiteness and the people that think that they own the things that they hoard?
Sure.
It's an easy one.
Yes. So I think first and foremost, I think one of the ways in which we have those who have been fighting for reparations can you hear me now? Sorry. I think one of the ways in which we have conceded to whiteness, and when I say we, those who are actually fighting for reparations, is in two ways. First, you have people who have actually consumed the idea that if Afro-descended people, if indigenous people were to receive reparations, that they would take those resources and waste them away. You have that idea. And then you have the other idea, which is used as a strategy to demand reparations, which is that the reason why black people in particular, and the same argument I think is used for indigenous people, still need reparations from slavery is because they're still suffering the psychological effects of slavery. In other words, slavery and continuing manifestations of oppression have not just been dehumanizing, have not just been traumatic, they literally have resulted in the creation of a traumatized, dehumanized people. And so because we're a traumatized, dehumanized people, we need reparations to solve that problem. And I think that's another dominant idea within the reparations movement, which to me is based on a racist idea. Like, you can literally experience trauma, but as a group, and not result in being a traumatized people. You can be in a dehumanizing situation that doesn't necessarily result in you becoming a subhuman. And I think we need to sort of think about that. Like, but we think that if we describe a situation as traumatic, that we then have to say the people were traumatized, particularly when we're fighting for reparations, because we think that somehow is going to move or convince people to see the ways in which reparations is needed to, quote, repair the trauma, the dehumanization that indigenous and African people are facing, as opposed to repairing the trauma as resulted from the lack of resources, the lack of opportunities, the institutional and systemic violence that these people are being faced with. I think we can think about that in a different sort of way. Finally, I think we have to recognize that power is simply not going to hand over resources because we ask them to or we demand it, right? I think demanding is key, but in order to demand something, we have to demand it from a position of power. And so I think we have to recognize the ways in which you mobilize and organize power, because typically racist power has changed or provided resources when they were forced to do it and saw it within their own self-interest, or we were able to get in positions of power that, of course, gave us the ability. And so I think we should think in that, from that framework, as opposed to trying to educate those who have power and resources that we are traumatized, lowly, horrible people.
Let me, there's a sister out of Portland. I think she's a psychologist.
And can I say,
Yeah,
I didn't
please.
answer the second question.
Oh, yeah, please.
Very quickly. I think clearly it's impossible, I think, to create an anti-racist, to believe or to be an anti-racist and to not simply also be anti-capitalist. And I show in Stand from the Beginning that capitalism emerged in the what's called the long 15th century, 1440 to the mid 1500s. During that same period, that's when racism emerged. That's when racist policies that the Portuguese created to specifically enslave black people were fashioned. That's when racist ideas they created to justify their enslavement of these people were created. So really, the development of capitalism and racism they emerged at the same time, and they largely intersected. And they largely have fed off of each other. And you also have, I'll stop there, yes.
No. Are you satisfied?
I was waiting to hear your question.
Well, yeah, I want to ask you about this notion of post-traumatic slavery syndrome, which I forgot the sister's name out in Portland. Maybe someone in the audience can help me. What's that? Yeah, exactly. Are you refuting that notion, or are you just saying in the context of getting reparations that needs to be put aside?
So I wrote a piece last summer that the title of it was Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is a Racist Idea.
Right.
And I think I explained to you all how and why that is the case. To explain a little bit more, I think it is certainly the case that you have people who go through an oppressive environment, individuals who go through an oppressive environment and come out traumatized and engage in negative sort of traits as a result of that trauma. But you also have people who go through a similar traumatic situation and come out, in their estimation and through the estimation of society, stronger people. So people respond to trauma and adversity in different ways. And I think that's what we need to sort of recognize. So we can simultaneously say that those individual black people who clearly are acting in this way because of the racist trauma they've suffered, either through state violence or something else, and create resources and ways to help those individuals, while not saying that black people in general are traumatized people, are suffering from post-traumatic slave syndrome. Because that book and other studies like it use anecdotes to substantiate this idea that black people in general are acting negatively because of the effects of trauma. What I mean by anecdotes is they take individual examples, they take cases of individuals, and then use that individual cases to generalize black people. And that's no different than what racist ideas do. They look at an individual black person acting in a lazy fashion and say black people are lazy.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Evan. I'm also from the Radical Student Union. Going off of your last answer, I wanted to ask, when we talk about these systems of racism, of capitalism, when we talk about these bases of economic power that are also bases of racist ideology, and when we consider that these are the same bases that wield state violence and that historically have not been afraid to use that violence to defend their power, it seems to me that the only program that could really implement anti-racism is a revolutionary program that wields power economically, politically, and on a militant basis. I was wondering if you agree with that, and if so, or if not, what a program that might disassemble racism might look like.
So I agree with that. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Greetings.
Hello, how are you?
I'm the herald they call Ras Matunji.
Closer to the mic, please.
I said, I'm the herald they call Ras Matunji. Okay. And I give thanks for you to come here today. I hear your words, but I also feel your spirits. But, every day I wake up, I hear people talking about black and white. I can understand that they're still thinking about outward appearance. Because no one look at the conscience. You only can see through your physically, through physical appearance. But I want to mention about Marcus Garvey, who says that it's education that we become prepared for our duties and responsibility in life. I also want to draw a reference to the man called Kwame Nkrumah, who speak of conscientism as the practice to reinstitute the African dignity. Are we Africans so assimilated that we forget who we are? Or have we lost the understanding of the Most High in terms of good over evil?
So I think that the more that I studied this history of racist ideas, the more that I realized that these ideas, these racist ideas, were largely produced for black consumption. The more I speculated that that was the case. And the reason why I say that is because if the function of racist ideas are to suppress resistance to racial discrimination, and if the people who are most subjected to racial discrimination, people of color, or in the case of my book, black people, you're going to want, those are the people who are most likely to resist. And so therefore, you're going to want those people to consume your racist ideas so they can then believe that their skin color, their hair texture is abnormal, that they should be enslaved, that they should be impoverished, that they should not have leaders who look like them. You're going to make them believe that that's the case. You're going to make them believe that their history begins in slavery. And because then that causes them to look in the mirror and see the problem, as opposed to looking for the problem in the policies, oftentimes of people who don't look like them. And in seeing themselves as the problem, they're going to focus on undermining themselves, and as opposed to undermining what's precisely sort of harming them. And I've seen this, and so these, of course, assimilationist ideas, as a result, are, to me, quite widespread within the black community. And I think, and I sort of talk about the ways in which you even have black people in this text who are producing and reproducing assimilationist ideas that become quite popular. One of the examples that I give in this book is the idea of the broken black sort of female-headed family was largely an idea that came out of E. Franklin Frazier, who was a Howard University sociologist, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he wrote his report in 1965, in which he popularized this idea, largely cited E. Franklin Frazier. E. Franklin Frazier conceived of these ideas because he was essentially, it was this sort of interplay between his own patriarchal and racist ideas. Patriarchal ideas that stated that the finest family is a male-headed family, and then him looking out, so that's the sort of, and then looking out, that's a patriarchal sexist idea, and then looking out at the number of, or the greater number of female-led families in black communities and saying that's a problem, right? And then stating that, okay, this problem stemmed from slavery, but we can civilize these people and figure out ways to bring more black men in the households so those black men can basically take some of the resources that the woman is using for the children. Now, that's an extreme case, but I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, just because you have a man in the household, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But of course, we've been led to believe, even within the black community, that that's a problem, and that largely came out of black minds, just like you had people critiquing Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. Most notably, I talk about W.B. Du Bois and the debate between Du Bois and Garvey, and how Garvey was talking about issues of colorism, and Du Bois was making the case that colorism doesn't exist. And by the 1930s, Du Bois coming to recognize, you know what, Garvey was right in many ways.
Yep. Just one more thing. So can we conclude that racism, there is one form of racism, in the presence of evil in good?
So I mean, I think racist policies and racist ideas it certainly are a form of evil. I mean, I can't imagine that they're anything but evil.
Respect.
Thank you.
You talk about producers of racist thought. Black folks continuing to participate in non-African religion. Are we continuing the production of racist thought?
So now you're trying to get really
I am trying to get you in trouble here.
So I think that we have to recognize the way in which culture sort of operates, in which even within Africa, sort of traditional African religions are in many ways different now because of the march of cultural history.
So we can't break it from a pre-colonial.
Well, I just want to, and so compared to, let's say, how they were before the arrival of Europeans, or even 100 years ago. In the same token, when you take something like African American Christianity, and people identify African American Christianity as a European religion, because they identify Christianity as a European religion. I think that takes away from the fact that you have people, and when I say people, not just black people, you have people who have a cultural sort of foundation, and then they migrate to a different place. And the tools within that new environment don't allow them to replicate that old, basically, religion.
Yeah.
So then they take that cultural foundation and change the existing tools, religious tools, to create, in a sense, a new religion or a new language, right? And so when we think of like Ebonics or even African American Christianity, you know, you see the sort of, within African American Christianity, you see call and response. You see the role of the spirit world through the Holy Ghost. You see many principles that you see in traditional African religions operating within Christianity. And so I think we have to, and so I actually consider, people would disagree with me, but I actually consider African American Christianity to be an African religion. I actually consider Ebonics or Patois or Creole to be African languages because they were simply created by the people. And then you see the sort of phonetic and even sort of religious similarities between these two.
Yeah. Next question. I don't want to challenge that.
Hi, so earlier you said that race is a social construct, and I couldn't help but think about this hyphenated identity that has been perpetuated, subconsciously perpetuated in our minds, like every single time we fill out forms, especially for kids who are raised in the educational system here in America. We're always identifying as, you know, for myself, Asian American, right? And so the latter part of that identity, what is American? Does that mean that we are identifying American as whiteness? And so my question is, how do you even begin to unravel this cultural identity that doesn't have that whiteness enveloped in it, and whether it is even possible to identify it ourselves? And my second question is, anti-Blackness is absolutely prevalent in the Asian community here in the States, and I don't know where that came from. I mean, in China recently, there was a museum that displayed African tribes with animals, right? And so that also perpetuates the idea that Black people are animals, which is crazy, and that's all the way in China. They're not even part of America, right? But that also states the impact of America in the politics of the world, which is so sad to see. But the anti-Blackness here in the Asian community, most of the Asian community, we come from a line of refugees and immigrants. So when we came here to the States, we're looking for a new life here, and we're creating this new identity as well that has unknowingly enveloped that whiteness too. And so I feel like the concept of anti-Blackness in the community perpetuates from that whiteness. So my second question is, how do I even begin to bring up the topic of anti-Blackness within my fellow Asian sisters and brothers because of the concept of the model minority label that is also a white social construct as well?
Sure. I think the best way, to do it would be really to talk about the origins of the model minority construct.
Get your microphone closer to you. Closer to
sorry.
you. You just pull it up a little bit.
I think the best way to do it would be to talk to them about the origins and the meaning of the model minority construct. And so what I mean by what makes a particular group the model minority? That's the fundamental question. And then when you look at the history and you look at the white people who said it, what they were basically saying is that Asian Americans have been more likely to assimilate into whiteness. And so in other words, you can talk through the ways in which the creation of the ideas of the model minority is simultaneously creating this white standard and stating that Asians are more likely to reach that white standard than other groups. And then who are those other groups? Black people, who they're saying that have been the least likely to assimilate into whiteness. So you sort of talk about this idea of the white standard that is fundamental to the model minority concept. And so when you identify yourself as a model minority, you're simultaneously, you're not standardizing your own culture, your own group, you're standardizing whiteness. I think also we should recognize, as I stated earlier, that race is a global construct, and that it's circulating sort of around the world. And what's happening in Asia could certainly be a reflection of what the producers there are creating, their interactions not only with America, but Europe. And so race is a global construct, and it's constantly circulating and it's operating differently in similar ways in every nation. Finally, I actually, in my current book that I'm working on, I'm actually identifying race as a power construct.
Thank you.
Yes.
We only have time for these last two questions, so proceed.
Hi, my name is Adia Bailey. I am from Brunswick, Georgia, which is considered the deep rural Bible Belt of the South. So, okay.
Yeah.
So I have lived my whole life fighting racial ideals. And many white people around me have always believed that their ideas are allowed because it is a part of their history, whether they have Black friends or not. How do you combat the belief that many white Southerners feel is a part of their culture and traditions, which is normalized?
Sure. So I should say that I'll answer that question in two ways. First, that when I have interactions with people who are hostile, that have to do with what we're talking about. The first and most important thing that I seek to do with that person is to define a racist idea. And so I ask them, how do you define a racist idea? And I try to establish that definition before we can have a discussion about race or even about Black people. Because what's going to happen is either they're going to say that they're going to continue to say things that are racist, but then you have no way of basically showing them that those ideas are racist. But if you establish the definition first and say, so if anything that suggests a racial group is inferior is a racist idea, you agree with that? And then, then they say yes, then you can begin to have that discussion, because then when they start saying racist ideas, you can point back to their definition and say, well, that definition, according to you, that statement, according to you, is a racist idea. So I don't engage in discussions with people who are racist unless we've established what racism or what a racist idea is. Secondly, I do not spend my time trying to educate or convince away closed-minded, racist Americans. That to me is a complete waste of time. I think we can spend more time, I think it's more efficient for us to spend our time talking to open-minded racist Americans or engaged in organizing and mobilizing against racist policies. And again, if racist policies are leading to racist ideas, then once we undermine these racist policies, we're simultaneously going to undermine the cradle of racist ideas. And so even in my book, I state at the end of the prologue, this book is for open-minded people. If you're not open-minded, you don't have to read it.
Thank you.
With apologies to the sister just stepped up, we only have this last question we can do. We only have a minute left. So go ahead.
I want to say thank you. I'm horrible at microphones, so I want to say thank you for your stimulating presentation. And it's really hard to compact a question that has so much context in the life of a person that's lived as long as I have, but I'm going to try. So 3 threads that I wanted to have you comment on. The first was the question about a revolution and revolutionary ideas. And the second is, when I deal with racism, I think of it in the frame of violence. And I think that the foundation of our country is a foundation of a violence that's legitimized. And so if all of the people who are called black disappear from this country and they just decide that they're going to continue doing what they do, the system is still going to collapse upon itself because it believes that violence can be legitimized. And so when we talk about Christianity, when I look at the Gospels, the life of Jesus, and I synthesize what does it mean, I see it as a revolutionary approach because the most important force that Jesus brings is the force of love. That in his relationships, he shows how it's transformative and how it can create a force that makes people want to work towards justice. I was wondering if you could put together, when you say a revolutionary idea, what role do you have in how a revolution is unfolded so that at the end of the revolution, we have put together a society that's based on an opportunity for those who have committed evil to come to some kind of restorative justice, or those who have committed evil, that we're not just saying that there are people that can be discarded because they have also bought and believed the systems that have been taught to them. And the other one last thing is that many of us are in families with people that hold these ideas, and either we're going to divorce ourselves from our families or we're going to have conversations with people that don't have open minds.
Let the other question go.
So again, I think it's a different conversation when we're talking about our own personal lives and our political lives. And so I think certainly in your own personal lives, it's certainly worth having conversations with people who are with a family member who's closed-minded. We have to do that all the time, don't we? But I think from a political standpoint, that's a different sort of conversation. In terms of the sort of the idea of sort of radical revolution, I think that we should recognize that what needs to sort of be is we need to basically recognize that there are all of these sort of disparities, not only disparities as it relates to healthcare and incarceration, but disparities in power. And then ask the question, what are the policies or the powers sort of behind those disparities? And what a huge restructuring of society will do will essentially eliminate all of the policies that create disparities. And we would first and foremost identify any policy that creates an inequity is a discriminatory policy. And so we're not looking for intention, we're looking for outcome. And then we would seek to change those policies. We would seek to undermine or we would seek to get people who are against those policies and are for egalitarian policies and equal opportunity as it relates to race, gender, class, and so on and so forth, sexuality, in positions of power. And so the people who were previously in positions of power, they simply would not have the ability to be in positions of power. And so, because really it's not, I mean, black people, to give an example, it's one thing for a person to come up to you and demean you. It's yet another thing for that person to come up to you and demean you and be in a position of power. And so I think those people, yeah, you want to continue to demean us, but it doesn't matter because you're not in a position of power anymore, right? And so those people will certainly continue to persist and exist, but their ideas won't simply be empowered in the state, right? And so I think that that's really what I think we're talking about. And so what does it mean to have anti-racist power in particular is to simply have people who are committed to equal opportunity and people who are empowered by people who are committed to equal opportunity and people who are compelled to maintain policies that are committed to equal opportunity. And anything sort of short of that is simply a problem. And I think that's what people around the world, are pressing for. But instead of people who are opposed that saying, you know what, these people want equal opportunity, no, they want black supremacy, or they want, female supremacy, or, they want the poor to take everything. I mean, and that's the way they sort of change the narrative to get the people to believe that those policies in that new world won't benefit them. So then they clamor for the old world in which they're being oppressed. I'll end there. Thank you.
He's been very generous with his time and certainly his ideas and thoughts. So let's give